We have finally arrived to the Prince's Crusade. And, alright, now I think we're finally in the main meat of the Crusades, which is like the Princes, the main, Crusader force and whatnot. Not from the complete mess that was the People's Crusade. Alright, let's get to it.
Those who refused to convert were taken captive and carted to Antioch, Aleppo, and as far as Khorasan. 3,000 managed to reach a nearby ruined castle and hold off the attackers with improvised fortifications. The following day, a single boat managed to reach Constantinople, prompting Alexios to send his fleet and rescue a fragment of the people who initially set out from France. Anna Komnena's description of the dead no doubt exaggerated their numbers, but it nonetheless provides a good sense of how the slaughter must have looked to the next wave of crusaders arriving 9 months later. When they gathered the remains of the fallen, lying on every side, they heaped up, I will not say a mighty ridge or hill or peak, but a mountain of considerable height and depth and width, so huge was the mass of bones. The so-called Peasant Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, left a bitter taste in Emperor Alexios' mouth, but he was still determined to carry out his plan. Dyrrhachium was designated as the rendezvous point, where Byzantine officials and interpreters, along with large stockpiles of provisions and gifts, awaited the army, probably the largest since the days of the United Roman Empire. To quote the chronicler and participant of the Prince's Crusade, Fulcher of Chartres, whoever heard of such a mixture of languages in one army? There were Franks, Flemings, Frisians, Gauls, Allobroges, Lotharingians, Alemanni, Bavarians, Normans, English, Scots, Aquitanians, Italians, Dacians, Apulians, Iberians, Bretons, Greeks, and Armenians. If any Breton or Teuton wished to question me, I could neither reply nor understand.
Dude, that's the thing with the language barrier, right? The translators are the unsung heroes of this because they're working overtime. They're like, we need to translate everything to everyone. Like, yeah, but that also goes to show you just why the Crusades were often so divided even amongst themselves, because just look at this, not only in terms of politics with rival kingdoms and stuff, like having to put aside differences, but just there's so much, it's like coordinating this and just talking to people is insane.
The earliest group was that of Hugh, Count of Vermandois, brother of the excommunicated French king, and one of the two actual princes in this Prince's Crusade. In February 1096, he led a council in Paris, discussing the logistics and goals of the expedition, which he intended to lead. Coincidentally, a lunar eclipse occurred during the negotiations, and thousands of Parisians observed as the moon became blood red. During the next several months, commoners and nobles alike sold off their possessions as they needed the currency to buy provisions along the way, which led to a rare case of mass deflation due to the shortage of hard coinage. The group headed out towards Constantinople at the agreed-upon date of August 15th, and along the way was joined by the remnants of Count Emico's force, most of whom were knights. Upon reaching Bari in October, Hugh sent a few envoys to Dyrrhachium with the words, "Be it known to you, Duke, that our Lord Hugh is almost here. He brings with him from Rome the golden standard of St. Peter. Understand, moreover, that he is the supreme commander of the Frankish army. See to it then that he is accorded a reception worthy of his rank, and yourself prepare to meet him." Unfortunately for Hugh, however, another natural disaster intervened, as most of his fleet was sunk.
I'm sandwiched between the two
During the treacherous crossing of the Adriatic. The prince himself was found on the coast near Dyrrhachium, shipwrecked and without the majority of his army and supplies. The remnants were greeted warmly, outfitted and fed, before being escorted to Alexios by Admiral Manuel Voutomitis. The second group was led by Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lorraine, who spent the last 20 years of his life fighting for the Holy Roman Emperor against the papacy, and defending his own lands from a coalition of claimants. Despite tracing his ancestry to Charlemagne himself, his titles were not hereditary, which meant that his position was very unstable. So when the preachings of Urban and Peter reached him, Godfrey answered the call with great enthusiasm. He sold off most of his estates, mortgaged his great castle of Bouillon to the Bishop of Liege, and extorted many Jewish citizens in order to equip a formidable army, which included his brother Baldwin and many knights and nobles.
Okay, among the participants were their cousins Baldwin of Rethel and Lord of Le Bourg, Baldwin II, Count of Hainault, Reynold, Count of Toul, Warner of Grey, Dudo of Cons. Oh my gosh. So Baldwin, Peter, and the brothers Henry and Geoffrey, who stood out. Okay.
In order to avoid the papacy, his second army decided to pass the same land route taken by the People's Crusade via Hungary. In early October, King Coloman was given Godfrey's brother as hostage in case the Crusaders decided to raid the countryside, and convinced him to grant the Crusaders passage after he pledged that there would be no raiding. There were no accidents along the way, thanks to the high discipline and warning that anyone who defied Godfrey would be killed, and by November he was reunited with his brother and entered the sacked city of Belgrade. By the time they reached Niš, the Crusaders met up with their Byzantine escorts, who
Yeah, good thing for the Hungarians though. They were tired of the Crusaders at that point. But yeah, we're getting the cast together. Hughes, Godfrey. I'm trying to think. I think there's a few more, but yeah, we're getting the main cast together for this.
Guaranteed that the army would be well fed along the way, with each city generously handing out grain, wine, oil, and meat. Some of the nobles were so impressed by this warm welcome that they raced to Constantinople, hoping to get more gifts, at which point they heard a rumor that the French prince was imprisoned. On December 12th, Godfrey halted at Salimbria, and what had until this point been an unprecedented peaceful movement turned to raiding and looting of the countryside after the demand to release Hugh was rejected. Alexios sent 2 Franks in his service to calm things down, and by December 23rd, the army made camp outside Constantinople along the Golden Horn, where Hugh awaited Godfrey to assure him that the rumor was false. The Lotharingians were puzzled and further infuriated as some survivors of the Battle of Civitot blamed Alexios for the disaster, and as a result, Godfrey refused his invitation to meet the emperor personally. Alexios responded by closing his markets to the Crusaders, and hostilities were resumed.
My goodness. I'm telling you, man, that's the thing with all these, situations, right? The poor Romans, at this point, it's the Western forces can be such a big headache as much as the East, And it's he has to kind of deal with it, because you have so many misunderstandings, people who are just ready to jump the Romans at any given opportunity, and also managing just the huge egos of these, other nobles and stuff, It's amazing. Alexios had his hands full. He had his work cut out for him for this,
Insults, scare tactics, and a short-lived Christmas truce ensued, before Alexios sent several ships filled with Pecheneg archers to harass the Frankish camp, while Godfrey marched towards Constantinople, aiming to assault it.
Goodness.
His brother Baldwin led 500 soldiers, who attempted to set the city gate on fire. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, but eventually the attack was repulsed. After 6 more days of plundering the countryside, the Crusaders were shocked when an imperial envoy arrived and announced that Alexios was ready to make peace and deliver his own son and heir, John, as a hostage. With this guarantee, Godfrey entered the city with a small entourage.
That's insane. I don't remember that happening.
Instead of a vengeful enemy, he met a generous host. "I have heard about you," Alexios told him, "that you are a very powerful knight and prince in your land, and a very wise man and completely honest. Because of this, I am taking you as my adopted son, and I am putting everything I possess in your power, so that my empire and land can be freed and saved through you from the present and future multitudes. In return for numerous gifts, Godfrey swore an oath that he would not harm imperial subjects and return any land taken conquered from the Turks to Alexios. Some sources misunderstand this oath as one of vassalage, but this was a masterful use of a familiar custom for a completely different purpose. Mercenaries in the service of Byzantium were forced to make a similar oath, but were given titles and land in return. In this case, Alexios became the supreme commander of the expedition, offering gifts instead of land.
Again, like, just the big brain maneuvers this guy is like, he's like, okay, I'm gonna have to. He's really the perfect man to handle this situation, like, you know what I mean? Like, calm, collected, cunning, shrewd. Like, Alexios is the perfect man to deal with these people, you know? Again, amazing.
When he returned to his camp, Godfrey ordered his men to keep the peace and began boarding Byzantine ships, who transported him across the Bosphorus along with Hugh and Peter the Hermit. The third Crusader force was that of Bohemond, who had been disinherited by his father, Robert Guiscard, in favour of his younger half-brother, Roger Borsa, leaving Bohemond with just Taranto and Bari. In 1096, he was helping his uncle lay siege to Amalfi, when he heard that a massive army was making its way to the Holy Land, with crosses on their shoulders. With little to lose, Bohemond prepared to invade Byzantium once more, and tore off his expensive garment and had it cut into crosses for his men. Many warriors stepped forward under the pretext of this religious movement, and 500 knights, along with many footmen, abandoned the siege to travel east. The experienced commander ordered that his men land at multiple points across the Adriatic coastline, before meeting up in the city of Valona on November 1st. They were instructed to not plunder the countryside, and claim only as much food as they needed. But as they arrived at their former base of operations in Castoria, the garrison refused to share their supplies, which led to another series of widespread looting, during which an entire community of Paulicians was eradicated at Pelagonia.
My goodness.
As the army reached the Via Egnatia, they were met by a group of Pecheneg mounted archers, who harassed them with the tried and tested nomadic tactics. The Crusaders prevailed.
At Wells Fargo, we get it.
And several Pechenegs were captured, but as soon as Bohemond found out they were carrying out imperial orders, he let them go. Eventually, a high official met with the Normans, who smoothed things over and provided them with supplies. At the same time, Bohemond attempted to make contact with Godfrey and offered a joint attack against the Empire, but his message arrived just as he was making peace with Alexios. Bohemond had some of the best soldiers in the world, but his contingent was small, so he decided to enter Constantinople as a friend. Upon meeting his old rival, Alexios once again showed him the best hospitality he could hope for. During a feast,
What's with that music? But, yeah, Alexios, man. You're seeing him use his diplomatic chops to really win these people over. I'm telling you, this guy's patience, his diplomacy, might be some of the best I've ever seen, because he's handling this as best as you can, I think. I think as best as a person could, he handled it, in my humble opinion.
Bohemond was offered both cooked and raw meat, in case he feared that it was poisoned. The Norman decided to pick the latter, and prepared the meal himself. Later, he began negotiating with Alexios in his native Greek language, and suggested that he should become Domestikos of the East, or Chief Commander of the Eastern Lands. The request was denied, and instead, he was promised ownership of any lands east of Antioch, as well as being designated as an imperial agent. After agreeing and swearing the same oath as other crusaders, Bohemond returned to his quarters, which were filled with precious objects, coins, and silk. Not everyone in Bohemond's army was happy about this. His nephew, Tancred, had no intentions to play sophisticated mind games, and instead crossed the Bosphorus with the bulk of the Norman forces. That same day, the third and by far the largest Crusader army, making up half of the total force, arrived at Constantinople. Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, was extremely rich and more powerful than the French king himself, having recently inherited Provence. By his marriage with Elvira of Aragon, he was connected with the royal houses of Iberia and fought several wars there. He was the only Crusade leader who personally discussed the project with Pope Urban and was fully committed to it. He brought his wife and heir, as well as several noblemen from southern France. But his most influential follower was the spiritual leader and first Crusader bishop, Adhemar of Le Puy. Raymond had no intention to return to France, and it took a long time to put his affairs in order, which delayed his departure. Additionally, instead of taking the suggested route via Bari or the popular land route, he decided to travel via the Adriatic coast through the harsh roads of Dalmatia in the winter, where his army was harassed by Slavic tribes. Eventually, the army made its way to Dyrrhachium and resupplied, but they became wary of the Pecheneг parties sent to watch their actions. It was very difficult to control such a vast force, and before long, hostilities broke out. Several barons were killed during hit-and-run attacks, and Bishop Adhemar was captured by several Pechenegs who were about to kill him when one of them pointed out who he was and fled. Upon reaching Thessaloniki, the bishop and other wounded men were left to receive proper treatment, while the rest of the force marched and reached Redosto. The envoys from the capital invited Raymond to an audience with Alexios, where he could meet up with the other Crusade leaders. Fearing that the leadership of the Crusade was slipping from his hands, he raced towards Constantinople, leaving behind a leaderless army, which naturally began pillaging the countryside.
Oh my goodness.
Raymond was
always kind of a mess, huh? Yeah, just like the freaking Byzantines keep getting raided, man.
Received as well as the other leaders, but when he was asked to swear an oath, recognizing Alexios as the overall commander, and told he could take no land for himself, he was outraged. Bohemond approached him and tried to act as a mediator, but after things went sour, he pledged that if Raymond would go to war with Alexios, the Normans would stand with Byzantium. Once again, Alexios stepped up to the challenge by waiting for Bohemond to leave and assuring Raymond that the Normans were the real enemy and that the two should stand together in case they betray the cause. Finally, on April 26th, Raymond swore a modified oath of non-aggression and joined the rest of the party on the other side of the Bosphorus.
Again, man, just like Alexios, man, he is the MVP. He is carrying so hard of trying to keep things like civil. Just so many egos, right? So much like big heads all having to like work together. It is insane that this works out, by the way. Can I just say that? It's insane that the First Crusade works out. But yeah.
The last Crusader army was a combined force of 3 contingents. Robert, Duke of Normandy, was the son of William the Conqueror, and was very experienced in warfare as a result of waging a war against him and his brothers after a terrible falling out over a prank. After his defeat at the hands of his own son, William only allowed him to inherit Normandy, despite being his firstborn, while his other son received England. Naturally, civil war ensued, and Robert lost, causing many of his barons to desert him. So when the call to crusade arrived, Robert was more than willing to join, especially since his grandfather died on his way to Jerusalem. So he ceded temporary control over Normandy in return for 10,000 marks of silver. His cousin, Robert Count of Flanders, also had a father who made the pilgrimage in 1089, and agreed to send Alexios 500 Flemish warriors. After Robert received a personal letter from Urban II, he was more than willing to join. Stefan of Blois, on the other hand, was not moved by the Pope, but as the husband of Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror, who made the decisions in the household, he was bound to her will, and when she wanted him to go, he agreed and left her in charge of his rich lands. The combined force of these three main leaders crossed the Alps and met with the Pope in Lucca, who gave them his blessings before they reached Bari. Robert of Flanders immediately crossed and had a smooth and uneventful journey all the way to Constantinople, except for losing one of his vassals, who fought a naval battle against the Byzantine fleet after he tried to sail further south from the agreed-upon route. The other two leaders, on the other hand, decided to wait until the following spring, which led to a mass desertion as men sold their bows to make it back home. Eventually, Robert of Normandy and Stefan of Blois made it to Constantinople and were delighted by the warm welcome, the latter writing back to his wife, "Your father, my love, gave me many great presents, but he was almost nothing in comparison with this man."
Dang. Again, Alexios's PR is amazing. And yeah, again, like, this was probably one of the more smoother ones. That's taking place. But yeah, and I remember from the Extra History series that Robert of Flanders, aside from like his safe, pretty smooth passage to Constantinople, actually just like was more like, yeah, I'll help you. Like, he's probably the chillest of these guys. So probably, really useful,
The combined Crusader force was assembled at Civitot, which was fully stocked with supplies and constantly receiving more goods from the Byzantine merchants, which were sold at a fixed and fair price by the state. When we factor in the losses sustained along the way to Constantinople due to starvation, skirmishes, disease, shipwreck, and above all desertion, it is difficult to give an estimate of the total force, which also included remnants of the People's Crusade. That being said, thanks to the dozens of accounts, many of which were written by priests in the Crusader entourage, the starting figure at Civitot was most likely around 80,000, around 7,500 of which were mounted knights, 30,000 infantry, with the rest being camp followers. It is very important to note that among them, there was a giant baggage train of pack animals, as each knight was accompanied by a warhorse, a palfrey, and a mule, a number which more than tripled if that knight was prominent. The fact that Byzantium kept up with the logistical demands shows that their level of determination and preparation matched that of the Crusaders. Added to this giant force was the trusted general Tatikios, alongside 2,000 Byzantine infantry. In April 1097, most of the host was on the move through the Roman roads that had to be cleared from overgrowth and marked with crosses, leading the way towards the first major goal, Nicaea. The majority of the army reached its destination on May 6th and witnessed the massive fortifications built by Emperor Hadrian and consistently repaired by the Byzantines until they offered the Seljuk Turks to become its garrison. Nicaea was located at a very strategic location and defended by massive walls stretching for 5 kilometers, 10 meters tall, with 117 round towers, each 17 meters tall. To add to that, there was a double ditch, 4 formidable gates, and to the west, the city hugged the Ascanian Lake. The Turks manning these walls were expert marksmen, who repelled the Byzantine efforts to retake the fortress in 1081 and 1086. As the site of the First Ecumenical Council, called by Constantine, the loss of this city had a deep impact on all Christians, and seeing the mutilated remnants of the People's Crusade only strengthened the Crusaders' resolve. Meanwhile, the Sultan Kilij Arslan was confident in the strengths of his capital and left his family and treasury to go to Melitene on the other side of Anatolia, after he found out that his rival, the Danishmends, were trying to take it. In his eyes, the Crusader threat was dealt with, but after he read the report, showing that
yeah, again, like, he's like, oh yeah, we just dealt with the People's Crusade, complete chumps, and then like, yeah, what he doesn't realize is that this is the legitimate Warriors Crusade, with soldiers and people who, at least compared to the Peoples, know what they're doing. Yeah.
This force was several times larger than the one he defeated. He immediately rushed back, arriving on May 14th. Initially, some of the Crusaders who reached the walls attempted to assault the fortress, but were soundly defeated. Around the same time, 2 spies were caught, revealing that the Sultan was in the vicinity. The Crusaders immediately sent messages to Raymond to hurry his advance and position himself on the south gate in order to encircle the city before the garrison was reinforced. The Provençal detachment made up half of the Crusader force and was in the middle of setting up camp when 10,000 Turks charged at them with screams and arrows. The Franks were exhausted, but formed up and held the line, with Raymond in the vanguard and Bishop Adhemar delivering his first battlefield oration. "Now eternal life is at hand for you, indeed for anyone who might be crowned a martyr in battle. Go forth confidently against these enemies of the living God, and God will allow you today to achieve victory."
Moment of truth time. Heck yeah. Arslan has actually quite the uphill, his own challenge in terms of he's dealing with an enemy, you know, more experienced. Again, who knows what they're doing in battle, so already it will be a greater challenge than the People's Crusade, who just had no discipline or any of that, you know?
For hours, the Seljuks were unsuccessful in breaking the line, before Godfrey and Robert of Flanders arrived and charged at their right flank. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, but the Sultan was repelled. The Christians took no prisoners. Thousands of heads were rounded up. Some were sent to Alexios, who made camp at the nearby city of Pelicanum. Others were catapulted over the walls, and even more were impaled on spears as a warning to the city garrison. In return, the defenders used a device with sharp iron claws, attaching a chain to clasp a corpse and hang it from the battlements.
Brutal, man. They are sending a message. Holy crap.
By June 3rd, the last Crusaders joined the camp and started settling down for a protracted siege.
Heck yeah, the gang's all together, you know, finally have all assembled, and we're getting to it. But I kind of like what the Byzantines do here. They managed to take the city, which the Crusaders probably would have done bad things to, but like, again, in another act of shrewdness, the Romans will manage to take the city without any mass slaughter, if I remember correctly.
They formed a council, which created a shared treasury and coordinated the actions of the various regiments, and began building siege engines. The first of which was called the Fox, a structure resembling a ram, aimed at protecting a group of sappers which advanced under the cover of crossbow and mangonel fire. But as it was making its way towards the wall, it collapsed, killing the 20 men below it. Next, they tried siege ladders, but that also failed due to the masterful architecture of the city's defenses. Another ram was constructed and lit ablaze as the Turks poured Greek fire and destroyed it. Eventually, Raymond had a chief engineer who built the Turtle, an improved model of the first ram, which made it to a damaged and leaning tower called Gonatus. Its sloped sides allowed it to reach the wall, where a group of sappers began digging at its foundation. As the tunnel extended, they placed wooden beams for support. Once they were deep enough, the beams were set on fire and the entire tower collapsed. Unfortunately, darkness set in and the assault was postponed for the following morning. But to their surprise, the Crusaders discovered that the garrison worked through the night piling rocks and sealed the breach. In the meantime, Alexios was executing a plan of his own, fearing that the city would be sacked, or worse, that the Crusaders would go back on their word, taking it for themselves. He sent out his admiral, Vutamitis, who entered the city and attempted to...
Yeah, Alexios is smart not to trust these people. Like, he knows that these Crusaders probably turn on him at the smallest inconvenience, so his idea of, like, not trusting them and doing this was really smart on his part, you know?
Negotiated surrender. His first attempt ended in failure, but then the Byzantines, using ropes, carts, oxen and horses, carried a small fleet over the mountains to the lake. As the tower collapsed, the wife of Kilij Arslan attempted to flee the city on a ship, only to be captured by said fleet. At this point, Nicaea was fully surrounded and could no longer receive supplies from the lake. Vuitamites entered the garrison once more, carrying a message written in gold, promising that the defenders would be massacred by the Crusaders if they didn't surrender to the Emperor. The deal was accepted, but a final bit of statecraft had to be executed. General Tatikios announced that a massive assault would be coordinated on the morning of June 19th. The army would carry crosses and imperial banners around the city and then attack on all sides. The Crusaders agreed and armed themselves when suddenly Roman standards flew over the ramparts. Nicaea had fallen to the Byzantine forces attacking from the west, and as some proclaimed, "Glory to you, Lord," others were perplexed and began to wonder what was the real purpose of this crusade.
Let's not forget, this was a lot of the part to kind of help the Romans. That kind of played a huge part in why all of this got going. I know not obviously the other factors such as religious fervor and defeating, the enemy and Jerusalem, all that played a huge part. But again, the Romans, man, managed to assemble all of that and really help, So again, this was another smart move from the Romans. And from here on out, things are gonna rev up, so I'm really looking forward to seeing the rest of this. So I'll see you guys tomorrow when we cover, yeah, I'll just see you guys tomorrow.